Hi there, and welcome to Winning in Professional Services. I'm Scott Pressimone, and I'm joined by my co-host today, Matteo Travato. So the topic of the day, is it worth hiring or outsourcing to a marketing agency? Now, this is a hot topic. We could seem as individuals that are in the marketing space, very likely seen as like a bias sort of topic. Should you hire a marketing agency? Of course, we're the agency for you to hire or something like this. I would like to start out by saying I am not an agency. I'm a fractional CMO, and Matteo has a high performance agency. And I think that we might have some areas we agree in, some areas that we might come at different angles at. So I think you're going to get a less biased view of this, despite the fact that we're both in the marketing space, and hopefully have a pretty dynamic conversation. But I want to start with you, Matteo. Maybe we start by your experience. What has been your experience either on the agency side or the client side so we know what angle you're coming at this as?
Yeah. Yeah, I've worked at several agencies in the past before starting RevPath, my agency. And the types of agencies I worked at were either specialized in a very specific service. It could be e-commerce agencies specifically, or full service type of digital marketing agencies offering everything under the sun pretty much. That could have been website design, website support, marketing, digital marketing services. And whereas at RevPath, I focus specifically on revenue focused marketing services. So the focus for me is just to offer services that are actually moving the needle and impacting the bottom line of the clients I work with. And I'm not saying that my services are better than the agencies I worked at in the past. I think it's just probably a different target market also, the type of companies that I work with versus the companies that maybe a full service agency targets, or even like an e-commerce specific agency works with. Obviously, that already in the name, right? So e-commerce brands would gravitate more towards that type of agency partners. So again, my perspective is, again, mostly focused around the fact that in my mind, an agency should be helping businesses increase their bottom line and focus on metrics that are actually relevant to the company growth rather than vanity metrics where they may seem, okay, we're working on an SEO campaign and our North Star metric is maybe increasing the number of page one rankings for our website, but we are not really focusing much on how those rankings actually translate into more customers for us or more revenues and all that type of stuff.
Mm. Yeah, absolutely. And I think not all agencies are alike. And the point that you're making there is there are some agencies that maybe try to be everything, and then some that are very specialized. And you need to make sure that you're matching with the right type of company or you're hiring the right type of company, which is obviously what we're going to dive into today. From my perspective, briefly, I am a fractional CMO. So basically, that means I lead the marketing department of more than one company at a time. And oftentimes that means I'm working with the strategy. Oftentimes that also means I'm hiring an agency because there's some areas where I can't necessarily assist. And some of the marketing teams that I coach or guide or lead don't necessarily have all the skills required to do some of the things that we need to do. So that requires me to source either freelancers or agencies in certain cases. But of course, I have worked on the agency side, and that's why I believe, just like you, Matteo, can give some advice on how to hire an agency more appropriately because we've seen how the sausage is made at more than one agency, perhaps, right? So to get started into the meat of this, when are some times that we might want to hire an agency? So Matteo, you want to kick off with this one?
Yeah, I think the most common time when a company would think about hiring an agency is when they don't have an internal marketing team or department themselves, and they realize that marketing is an aspect that potentially they have disregarded in the past, and they realize it's an important uh, part of their business that is potentially missing that needs to be built out. And that's when looking for a marketing agency could be a good time when that realization comes.
Yeah, absolutely. I think if you don't have the team to be able to deliver something. You don't have a knowledge in a certain area. Maybe there's a certain marketing channel you're trying to develop and the skill set of your team just can't fulfill that need, then that's a time to maybe identify what agency you might want to work with. And yeah, of course, a lack of time. If you have lack of time, lack of resources, then you could probably want to work with an agency. Now, having said that, we'll get into this deeper later. But just because you don't have enough money to hire an internal team and you don't have enough time to do the work, I think you can sometimes get into the trouble of thinking, I know I'll outsource to a marketing team. They'll be inexpensive and they'll be able to do all the work without me. Right. So it's trying to combat that feeling of you don't have the resources, you don't have the time, therefore marketing agencies solve that problem. And while I think a part of that is true, there's certainly less risk when you're hiring an agency than maybe when you're hiring internal. I would say that it's not the be all end all. It's not the full solution because in fact you can get into some trouble hiring an agency. What do you think about that, Matteo?
I agree. I think it's outsourcing your marketing tasks to an agency isn't the same as working with an agency. I think those are probably two different things. There's a little bit of nuance there. You could say, I have a bunch of marketing tasks that I, as the owner, know need to get done, but I don't have internal resources to get them done. So I hire someone to do them. So I instruct someone to do those tasks. And maybe that's okay. But if you actually want to develop a marketing department or develop a marketing function that maybe you don't want to do by hiring full-time employees, but you want to do it with an agency, then I think at that point you have to think about how do I work with the agency to make sure that the agency has the best shot at making my company successful through marketing as the vehicle. But yeah, I think that's a little bit of a difference in my opinion there. What do you think?
Yeah, that's actually a really simple way to put it. It's that you can think I'm going to outsource and hire an agency to do all the things I want, or you can say, I think I'm going to hire an agency to get this marketing thing out of sight, out of mind. I don't want to deal with it. Or you can say, I actually don't know a certain thing and I need help and I need experts. I need to work with an agency, work with. I think that's a really good way to put it, Matteo. And that shows that, yeah, I know this is a silly sales thing to say. It's a partnership. Every probably marketing website says, we work with you in a partnership. I do believe it to be the case. I believe it's necessary, as you said, to work in a partnership. But I think there are a
Mhm.
lot of agencies that use those words and aren't actually doing it. I think it absolutely is necessary. If you want to get the most out of an agency, you need to work with them. You need to have regular meetings. You need to sync up about things that are happening in the company. You need to have strategy sessions together. Perhaps you don't need to if it's one of the other situations that you said, Matteo. You just need someone to do something, update my website or whatever else. Fine, maybe that's not the case. But I think if you actually want marketing results, which you also said, then you need a relationship with the company and the people you're working with. So let's jump into then the benefits of hiring an agency. What are some benefits that you think there are, Matteo?
I think, first of all, probably the fact that you are able to bring in expertise really quickly. And the agency, or most agencies, should have quote unquote battle tested processes that they have used with many other businesses potentially similar to yours in the past, so that they come in with already a set of workflows and ideas, so you don't have to train anyone to first of all they would potentially spend some time learning about your business, but once that initial phase is over, they would start ideating with you on what type of campaigns they would like you to run, or they would consult with you and think about what type of campaigns to run together. And so just the fact that they can come in very quickly and start getting the marketing engine started, I think it's a big benefit of hiring an agency.
Oh yeah, and I know you're just layering this in here, Matteo, as you're speaking, but you said you phrased some things in a certain way, which is that agency is going to want you to do certain things or they're going to advise on certain things. And that speaks again to the fact that you're not hiring them to tell them what to do, you're hiring them for their expertise. And in some cases, I think that does mean you might get a bit of tough love, right? So that doesn't mean you should, if you're hiring an agency, you're paying the money. Yes, you need to get something out of that and the person isn't necessarily going to be a consultant that's just going to tell you all the things to do. But there are going to be times that you're going to want to do something. The agency is going to have it, or the person you're speaking with might have an opinion on that. And hopefully they have some experience that they can bring to light, and maybe that means you'll go in a different direction than you originally thought. But if the agency is doing everything that you said, chances are they're not an agency with a lot of experience, because the likelihood that you know exactly what you need to get done is pretty unlikely, to be honest, right? I'd say another benefit of hiring an agency is the ability to scale up and down. While I personally do believe that it's important to have an internal marketing function in a company, I think that if you are hiring a full in-house team where you have an ad specialist and a TikTok specialist and a YouTube or a video specialist, and you have all these specialists, then when you have inevitably downturns in the economy or whatever else, you then have to fund all these people in the full-time salaries, right? And that can be a challenge. And so you're not going to be super nimble and flexible. So I think that when you're leveraging an agency, you now have the ability to scale those services up and down more easily than you can scale up and down full-time hires. So that's another benefit, and just overall probably reduction in risk as well. Now, what
Maybe
about
another
some?
one could be that I think at least if you hire agencies that come in with maybe even expertise from other industries, they would help you avoid tunnel vision, because as a business, sometimes you can get stuck on particular aspects of your marketing or advertising. You compare yourself to your competitors and you think what they're doing is the right way of doing it. And then sometimes try to emulate them or copy them. And whereas I think an agency is able to provide a wider or a wider perspective on how marketing should be done for your particular case and market, and just having that sort of third party perspective is extremely helpful, just so that you see that maybe the way you're looking at things is maybe a little bit too narrow minded at times, and just having an agency that can brighten up the horizon and show you different ways of doing things could be helpful.
Yeah, I think there are some agencies that will be super specialized in a certain industry or sector, and there can be advantages to that. But I really like your point there, Matteo. It's that sometimes the people that you're working with, if they've worked with other industries, they're going to get ideas from those other industries. They're going to get ideas of best practices that you might not have implemented. And ideally, you're getting some of these ideas from yourself and also inspiration from companies outside of your area. And that means that you can be the innovator rather than being the copycat of other of your competitors, basically, right? Now, there are some limitations of agencies. So, for instance, they're not the same as a full-time hire. They're not in your business constantly understanding who you are, what you're doing, because naturally an agency is set up to work with multiple clients at the same time, in which case you can't expect them to be the same as a full-time hire. Is there anything else that comes to your mind, Mateos, in terms of limitations?
One thing that comes to mind that I've seen happening many times and leads to all kinds of complications for clients specifically, especially first time agency clients that potentially go to a market in search for an agency to help them solve whatever problem they think they have, is that a lot of agencies business models are focused around generating high revenue. And what that means is that an agency is incentivized in keeping all of their clients, or as many clients as possible, on a monthly retainer. And the reason this happens is because a lot of agencies work on fairly low margins. We're talking probably less than 40% margins for most agencies. And so having a steady stream of retainers is probably the best thing an agency can do. And with that comes a lot of the downsides that I talked about at the beginning of focusing on vanity metrics, quote unquote. So all those type of metrics that on paper look like the agency is actually doing all the work that they are supposed to do, but at the end of the month, they don't translate into more revenue or more leads for the client. That's probably one of the biggest downsides I see. Maybe another one I see a lot is that a lot of agencies are mostly tactical executors than strategic agencies, or both. So they would immediately provide you with a medicine to your problem without diagnosing what the problem actually is. And the result could be fairly catastrophic sometimes, because you would essentially imagine going to a doctor without the doctor visiting you and just prescribing you a medicine, and you take it with no questions asked. That's a little risky in my opinion. And so those are maybe the two biggest sort of downsides or limits agencies sometimes have, or companies looking for agencies could see in those agencies. Yeah.
Yeah, when you mentioned vanity metrics, I do think similar situations I've experienced, Matteo, where the agency can be defensive because what they're trying to do is prove, "Oh, no, we're doing a good job. Look how many leads I got you last month. Look how many leads," right? And there's this disconnect because as an owner, you're thinking, okay, but they weren't good leads. Or as an owner, you're thinking, okay, but they weren't my target profile or whatever. Or it could be anything. But the point is, it's they're saying, look, we're doing our job. Here's the metrics to show it. And then you're looking at the bottom line and saying, but my profitability isn't high, or but the quality of the clients isn't high. And so you're almost speaking different languages. And to your point too, Matteo, I think that's almost a systemic problem in how the agencies are typically structured, or maybe the larger size. They have account managers, they have all these layers of things, and they're trying to manage their own profit margin. And realistically, it means that they have to spread themselves relatively thin. And then what are they doing? They're just trying to keep you satisfied enough. They're trying to prove, look, we're worth this retainer. Please don't fire us. And of course, they probably have a year-long contract or more. And yeah, I don't think it's intentional to not get you results, but it's maybe they're not necessarily always structured in a way that that you're not necessarily 100% aligned, basically. And as you said, Matteo, that might require this somewhat annoying process. I think sometimes some owners are thinking, oh, you have to do this process of asking me a lot of questions or going through and absorbing knowledge from me. This is annoying. Can't we just get started? I think the companies that aren't going through that process inevitably don't understand a lot about your business enough to give you the medicine. And the ones that you end up hiring maybe are the ones that are just going to say, sure, I'll write you the prescription right now. And then you're not happy at the end of the day, right? So I think part of the medicine, the real medicine, is to go through that discovery process with the agency, because then that's a red flag to me. If there's not a discovery process that's relatively in depth at the start of the process, that's a red flag for me. And we'll get into those a bit later in the episode. But I think that's just a necessary step. So let's see. Another thought that I had as far as limitation of an agency, perhaps if they're not going to come to the office, some agencies will come to your office or will visit for one of these discovery sessions, interview people from your team, whatnot. But then a lot of agencies won't, and they'll say, look, we just take care of the digital stuff. We're the online space. We're not going to help you with some of these other things that are offline. We're not maybe going to be able to help you too much with that webinar you're planning to do in office, things like this. So they're going to have some limitations because they're not physically present in the office. And so that is potentially fine, right? Again, if you have the internal resources that can handle those things, that's fine. But just know that if there's no one in the office at all that's handling marketing and you're 100% relying on an agency, then you might have a disconnect because the agency is living over here in the cloud, or they're living over here in the digital space, handling the digital stuff. And they're not necessarily connected to your team enough that other team members really know what's going on in terms of marketing. I think that does depend on the agency, depends on how close your relationship is, but that's just something to keep in mind.
Another one, maybe if I can, Scott, I think sometimes it's difficult to verify this, but generally a lot of agencies, and this plays again to how agencies are structured. I think a lot of agencies are very diluted. And what I mean by that is that the number of clients per specialist or account manager can be very high at times. So what that means is you're basically just a number in a big machine as a company hiring an agency where maybe an account manager and a specialist are working with 20 or 30 even sometimes different businesses, right? And they are allocating a fraction of their 40-hour week to your business. And then you're paying, I don't know, $2,000, $3,000, $4,000 a month for that fraction of the time that those people are dedicating to you. So I think those are important things that we potentially are going to discuss later on, some of the tips of how you can actually hire an agency and not get burned. But these are potentially some other limitations of agencies, the way I've experienced it myself in the past.
You're right. An agency is going to market themselves. And to your point, Matteo, they're going to say, look, you get expertise right away. Day one, you get expertise. This brilliant person, Jill, is the best ads person ever. And you never would have been able to hire Jill if you hadn't gone through our agency who's trained Jill. And she's just such a fantastic person. But then when you realize she might be the superstar Jill ads person, right? But if she's splitting her time 30 times, then how much agility are you actually getting there, right?
Yeah.
And so I think that's where you often get layering, where maybe that specialist is doing a good job doing their work, but then they have another layer or another position in the company that's there to manage the relationship or something like this. And you end up with these layers, and that's fine, but just keep in mind that you said it's diluting the expertise in a certain way and it's spreading someone quite thin, most likely. So I have children, right? And just think about when you're looking for schools for your children, what you might actually ask is, okay, what's the ratio of student to teachers, right? Okay, so each classroom has one teacher and 30 students. That might be fine. That might be a standard thing. But if the company becomes, if the school becomes very successful and all of a sudden they're jamming 50 students and then 100 students into a room, I think that's what happens sometimes with
Mhm.
agencies. They actually start off with a good ratio, they present the good ratio, but then when their messaging ends up being the state of, no, we've got this great specialist, and they don't really present how many specialists are working with each client as much, they're probably hiding that piece because they've maybe grown to a position where they're trying to get that profit margin up and the
Mhm.
ratios don't become as good. Again, I don't mean to jump ahead, but when it comes to looking for an agency, now that I'm thinking about it, I would be curious to ask, let's say, an agency what their ratio is to clients to specialists. And it might be a little bit hard to break down. Like I said, you might have account managers and specialists and other layers, and they might not be able to really give you clear one single number of ratio, and who knows what the right number is. But I think it's an interesting question to ask, is like,
Mhm.
how many clients does an account manager handle? How many ad specialists do you have, and who is my go-to ad specialist? How many accounts are they typically managing? You can just ask some of these questions and go with the flow to better understand what the actual interaction would be like with that agency.
I agree. And unfortunately, marketing agencies are, maybe this is one of the reasons why marketing agencies don't have such a good rep in the market. It's because marketing agencies unfortunately have mastered the art of selling their marketing services to people who don't understand marketing. And sometimes omitting crucial information could be part of their whole marketing messaging in some way. And what on a website, it's not always what happens behind closed doors, especially if you're working with a remote agency that is not physically in your town, in your city, that you cannot actually visit and see with your own eyes. Like you're basically just trusting whomever is on the other side of the screen that you're speaking to, that what they're saying is actually what they are for real. Yeah, it can be a little tricky. So again, due diligence always is important. It's like we were talking before, Scott. I think when you hire an agency, in my mind, it's pretty much just the same as when you are hiring a full-time employee. You want to do as much due diligence as possible. And like you said, you want to know who is going to be working on my account, what type of experience they have, how much time are they going to dedicate. And maybe you're not paying on an hourly basis, but still you want to understand how many other clients and accounts are these people managing simultaneously, because otherwise would it make maybe more sense for you to hire a full-timer rather than outsourcing to an agency that is, fractioning their employees to a point where you're basically just 1/50th of their time, essentially.
Absolutely. Now, with that said, Matteo, if you had I'm going to say an established professional services firm, let's say that your company has been around for 5 years now, you're
Mhm.
profitable, you're doing well. Maybe, let's say at this stage, you've managed to grow to a $5 million company, $5 million a year revenue, strictly through word of mouth referrals, your own sales efforts. Let's just say you got up to there. So you've pretty much not done much for marketing. Okay. Now the question becomes, Matteo, would you, in that situation, hire an agency?
I would hire an agency. I would, first of all, I will have to be honest with myself about a few things. First, if I'm a professional service company, the likelihood that I'm in a mature market is really high. So what that means is that if I'm hiring a marketing agency, I shouldn't expect my sales to skyrocket from today to tomorrow. That's just not going to happen. We're not a high technology company. We are a professional service company. So mature markets, first of all. So that's one thing. But yeah, I would hire a marketing agency, but the sort of the trade-off is that either myself as the owner or someone else within my company has to be able to dedicate time to build the relationship with the agency. And what I mean by building the relationship with the agency is essentially trying to help the agency do their job as best they can by providing as much insights about our own business to them. Because like you have said before, and I think there's something you said many times in the past in so many of our conversations, is that you cannot outsource your marketing success to an agency. And the only way you can lower that barrier as much as possible of allowing the agency to actually become more and more part of your company is by allowing them to have a door inside of your company. Show them what your company is, what your company does, what the problems are, and what the good thing about your company are as well, so that they can either double down on what works or avoid what doesn't work. But as long as you show the marketing agency more about your business, the better that relationship will be. And that is probably one of the biggest buts in my reason as to whether I would hire a marketing agency. There needs to be constant flow of communication between the company, my company, and the agency.
Yeah, absolutely. And you brought up the point of sales, and you and I talked about this before too, Matteo, is that if you need sales tomorrow, should you then hire a marketing agency?
Mm-hmm.
And as you said, it's that, hold on, if you're desperate for sales, and the way I set up this example, Matteo, we weren't necessarily desperate for sales, but in the case that you
Yeah.
are, what did you say there? So I need sales tomorrow. I'm not growing at the rate
Yeah.
I need. I need to hit my, targets in 2 months or 3 months, right? Is an agency going to get you those solutions, or is there another path you could take?
Again, if you need sales, maybe you got to 5 million in annual revenue through your own network and referrals. And maybe your network and referrals are drying up and you're starting to realize that something else needs to get done. I would say if sales is your number one priority, you shouldn't go and spend any amount of money on marketing, especially considering, like I said before, you are in a mature market. So if that's the case, go hire a sales manager or an outbound sales specialist, somebody that can actually either meet people face to face in your own local area or do a lot of outbound calls or outbound emails or outbound in general at events. That will probably yield the fastest return, in my opinion, for a professional service company. And maybe after the salesperson has paid for itself after a few months or a year, then maybe you can reinvest some of that extra profits into building a marketing engine that will maybe allow you to rely less on doing outbound in the future and a bit more into inbound, where leads are going to know more about your business and are going to come to you rather than you going to them. So that's the way I see it. If there is desperation, I would always advise not to go find a marketing agency. The problem is you're still going to find one. You're most likely going to find a marketing agency that is willing to accept your case, because marketing agencies also need to make money. So again, the problem again is that if you find that type of agency, they will most likely be very tactical. They will most likely try to find a way to help you get some leads, but I don't think it's going to be a sustainable marketing effort long term that is going to actually move the needle for your company. I haven't actually ever seen that happen, especially, like I said, I reiterate this, in mature industries, it's fairly difficult.
Yeah, that's where I think this might seem strange to some other people in other industries, but really focusing in professional services myself as well, I do think sales and marketing operate a little bit differently. In mature markets, you can't really expect a marketing team to come on board and all of a sudden get you a ton of leads, because as you said, if it's, let's say that you're selling legal services and there's 10 other firms selling legal services, you can't have some agency come to the rescue and say, ta-da, I've got the most creative ad you've ever seen, and it's going to bring in all these great leads that are going to close right away. That's just not how it works. So then you really need to learn how to make the distinction between sales and marketing, and then say, okay, you probably need sales and marketing to some extent. Maybe you go sales first if you don't have a sales team. But let's say that you do have a very small sales team. I still think that people end up putting a lot of this weight and say, marketing, go out there and get leads for this salesperson that's sitting at their desk waiting for the leads to come through. And I like the way you made that distinction there, Matteo. You were saying outbound. It's someone needs to be out there picking up the phone, calling, going to businesses, building relationships, nurturing those existing relationships, doing all that stuff. That's usually not going to be a marketing team, right? Just being honest is that marketers typically are marketers. They're not salespeople because they're not necessarily as good at talking and out there starting cold conversations. They're not typically going to be cold oriented individuals that like to knock on doors. So that's where the first thing makes sense is, yeah, invest in that sales function. Now, I would argue to a very good situation if you have what I call a minimum viable marketing team and maybe a minimum viable sales team, and you have relatively small teams that can work together. Because then you have someone knocking on doors and you have someone who can, a team that can deliver them collateral and other things to empower them to do a better job. And that's where I think it's a little bit more of 1 + 1 = 3, because you can actually get more out of it than you would for independent teams. Yeah. You have any
Another
thoughts?
thing that comes to mind is, like we said, in a mature market for professional service companies, the offering of a professional service company tends to be fairly undifferentiated. And what I mean by that is that a lot of accounting firm pretty much do the same thing. A lot of IT companies pretty much do the same thing. A lot of web agency, which we consider professional service companies, also do pretty much the same thing, right? So in my opinion, a good time potentially to hire a marketing agency, or would I hire a marketing, is whether I have a very differentiated offer or something that actually makes me stand out a little bit more from the rest of the companies that offer the same thing I offer, or the agency that I'm going to hire has a way to help me differentiate my offer. Because if I'm just going to throw my bait in the pond with all the other baits in the pond that are basically tasting exactly the same, I don't think it's gonna make a huge difference again in my favor as a business owner. So again, I would think about also how can I differentiate my offer or make it compelling enough to be different from other companies doing the same thing I do in my local area if I'm targeting local businesses.
Yeah, absolutely. And I often like the idea of hiring an agency once there's some internal function built up. So let's say you have a small sales team, a small marketing team, things are working well, you're getting referrals, you're getting some content going. But then to your point, maybe there's a specialization that we don't have. So maybe it is, I'm gonna use a silly example because you're not going to be promoting this accounting services on TikTok, but let's say that you don't have the specialization in TikTok or short form video. That could be a time to leverage an agency to help you bring in that expertise. Again, it would depend on the professional services firm, whether or not TikTok makes sense, but hopefully you get the point is that's a new specialization and that's something where it's like, hey, let me tap this specialist that's really good at this on the shoulder, see if we can bring them in. And ideally, they're probably not going to be super cheap, to be clear, because if they're good at their jobs, they don't have to be cheap. So they're going to be more specialized. They're going to be performance-oriented agency that you're working with, and they're going to be supplementing your team. And something that I think is important is ideally they're supplementing your team and they're also training your team a little bit, because you don't want to be 100% reliant on them. You want to better understand how they're working. And if they're more of the black box and say, oh, no, we take care of it. We don't need this from you. We don't need that from you. And we're not going to share the reports. We're going to share reports with you, but we're not going to show you how we got the performance. That's not a typical an agency I'd like to work. But then eventually you might phase out that agency and eventually you might bring in that function in-house. And that's the truth of it. You can even be honest with the agencies you're working with to do that. But I think the key being bring in a specialization that you don't have and allow your team to gain knowledge through that process. Now, that brings us into the last section of today, which is really tips for hiring an agency. Matteo, you want to start off with any tips that you have for anyone that's out there seeking an agency right now?
I would say just first of all, have clear goals and objectives when you go out and hire an agency. And I would say I think to be clear, I think the best way for me would be to have either a fractional CMO who is advising on what type of agency would be best to work with, or an internal marketing director, somebody that knows where the pain point is, and then go and hire the specific type of agency that is going to be needed to solve whatever issue, just like you said. If we are lacking on social media, then hire a social media specialist. If you're lacking on event marketing, then go hire somebody that is experienced with events. You will know this because if you attend events and spend any amount of money on a booth and then come out of that event with no ROI, you either stop doing events altogether or find a way to make those events a little bit more profitable. And if you don't have someone that can help you, then find a specialist who can do that. And I think the best way is to find someone that is able to advise on what agency is best for your business. As a business owner, you might not be maybe suited to do that yourself, and or even don't have the time really to go and evaluate vendors and then find what is the best agency that you can hire for a specific need that you have. So once you have identified that agency, I think having clear goals and objectives is one of the sort of most important things you can do or tips that you should consider implementing here. Have a clear idea of what are the KPIs that agency is going to be working against. And hopefully those KPIs are going to be related to revenue or some type of performance related KPI.
Right. Now, I'm also thinking you brought up some earlier points that are coming back to me, Matteo, and I can't help but draw this to either relationships or some other scenarios. But essentially, let's say you're in a bad situation. If you're in a bad situation and you're desperate, I'd argue that's probably not actually the time to seek out an agency, right? So it's very similar to if you're really hungry, you haven't eaten in 3 days, when you go into the grocery store, you're probably not going to pick up the healthiest of food. It's not a good time to go grocery shopping. Don't go grocery shopping. You'll probably get some Pop-Tarts and whatever else, and you'll get whatever they'll sell you, and it's not going to be a good decision-making time. If you are broken, you just got out of a long-term relationship, right? It's probably not a good time to meet your future loved one at the bar because you're probably going to be pretty desperate during that time. And as you said before, Matteo, if you say, I want exactly this, and I want someone who's going to make me this promise that they're going to get me this many leads in this amount of time, and they're going to say they don't need any information from me, and they're going to be my knight in shining armor or whatever, it's that there is someone that will take you up on that. The problem is they're the person that knows, maybe they're not knowingly lying to you, but they're going to either be the naive startup that just needs business, or they're going to be someone that's fine if they just churn and burn you over a period of time. But there will be someone that will say yes to those needs. Mm-hmm. But that's where I think you need to go in a little more level-headed and say, okay, I'm not going to go in desperate. I'm not going to go in seeking the world for the cost of nothing or whatever it is, and go in with the expectation that expensive things or things that are going to make you a lot of money are likely not going to be super, super cheap. And the companies that are high performance might not necessarily say yes to you right away. They might actually have a process for selecting their own clients. Because if they're the best XYZ agency out there, they might actually want to moderate the number of clients that they're picking up each month. Because if they're dealing with high maintenance clients that are going to waste their team's time, then they're not going to be able to get those ratios up to where their team is not overburdened or not being able to spend time on other clients. So they might be selected with the clients that they're working with, right? And so if you're coming in and you're just looking for someone to woo you to accept your business and to say yes to you a whole bunch and to whisper sweet nothings in your ear, you might not get the right company or agency to work with. So yeah, I can't help but draw that to relationships or anything else in the world, but don't go in desperate. You're not going to make good decisions.
I think generally, I would always advise never to hire an agency if the goal isn't to make it a long-term relationship. And then maybe just be clear about whether you need, like we discussed at the very beginning of this episode, whether you need somebody to execute on something that you already know you want to get done, or whether you need an advisor and implementer, right? Someone that can execute after they have advised you. I think there could even be a third way of considering hiring an agency. I haven't seen a lot of people do this, but it could be that, because actually what I imagine is that oftentimes a business owner doesn't know how to hire an agency, or even for that matter, a marketer, because they are not marketers themselves. So how am I going to evaluate this agency or this marketer if they actually can do what they are telling me they can do? But maybe another way could be, if you're thinking about building an internal marketing function or team within your company and you don't have certain expertise, you could potentially approach an agency and ask them if they're willing to work with you for, say, 3 to 6 months and essentially sell you their IP and you then implement everything, their processes, their decision-making processes, their workflows, and everything into your company. So essentially, you are working with them to bring whatever specialty they have into your business. So if an agency, if you're say you need to bring videography inside of your business, go find a videographer that can train your staff to create videos in-house, edited, storyboarded, everything that goes into creating videos. So you don't have to rely on agencies forever and ever. You're basically working with an agency, you buy their IP, and then you bring everything in-house. If that's maybe something you want to do and gives you maybe a little bit more peace of mind, maybe that's another way of thinking about working with an agency.
Yeah. I will admit my bias is I don't think you should necessarily aim to 100% get rid of agencies. I think there's always a need to grow and develop in new areas. And if you think that as you absorb expertise, that now that's just going to be the set way and you're just going to be able to continue to repeat it, it's like chances are times are going to change, mediums are going to change, marketing channels are going to change. So I think there's always this feeling of, this trajectory of bringing in more expertise so your team can do more, leveraging an agency in certain areas, and then building in some of that function, and then leveraging an area in other areas. And really, you're always leveling up your team, and then you're leveling up your whole marketing system. And the reason agencies are, again, in my opinion, still very good to lean on occasion is because it's easier to scale an agency up and down than it is to necessarily scale your team up and down. In any case, I think this is a lot of good advice. One other thing that you shared with me offline was the idea of when you're speaking with an agency, asking to speak with their team, asking to speak with the people that you're going to be working with, because sometimes there can be a distinction between the person who's selling you something and the person that's actually going to be working with you. So whether that be speaking with the account manager or speaking with a specialist or getting references of companies that are similar to yours and asking them good questions about how often they speak with their account manager, or how things have gone over the last year or so, just checking references, just because it's very similar, as you've shared before, Matteo, to hiring an internal hire. Yes, it's a little bit less risk in a certain way, but you should still do your due diligence. So speak, find the references, ask them questions, meet the team you're actually going to be working with, and ideally reduce the number of surprises that you have when you're working with that agency. But with that, is there anything else that I missed, Matteo? Anything else that you'd like to share as people are going through this journey?
Not really. I just think just be mindful of if you've been burned in the past, you probably can relate with a lot of the things we discussed in this episode. If you've never hired an agency before, I would say don't fear, but also be mindful of all the things that we have talked about, and talk with multiple agencies before you decide which one to work with. Sometimes it's easy to trust a referral from another company or another business owner who has had a good success with a certain agency, but I would still advise to do more research and then decide. I think that to me is probably the one of the most important things to think about when I'm working with an agency. Yeah.
Absolutely. Wise advice, Matteo. Thank you, Matteo, for joining this episode with me. And I do ask, if you're listening, then please do subscribe to our podcast. Or if you're watching us on YouTube, please do subscribe. That's really big for us in the early days of getting this podcast kickstarted. So please subscribe. If you do have questions for us, a topic that you'd like us to cover, I recommend you do that in the comments. So again, if you're on YouTube or anything, then please post that in the comments and help us build up our channel a little bit. And like I said, our goal is to provide as much value to you as possible. So share what you'd like us to talk about. Share what questions you have. And me and Matteo are very open to sharing everything, the good, bad, the ugly, right? All of it. And we'll talk through it all. But thanks so much for the time, and catch you on the next one.